I have to go. It's the only way.
Are you sure this is what you want?
The storm was fierce enough to bury a man alive. But as the lone cowboy rode through the freezing wind, he spotted something no one should ever see in the wilderness: a young bride, abandoned beside a broken wagon. She had no family, no shelter, and hope was the only thing keeping her alive. The wind howled across the open land like a living thing. Snow fell in thick waves, covering the plains and turning the world into a blur of white and gray. The storm had come fast that afternoon, rolling in from the distant hills and swallowing the quiet prairie. Most folks had already taken shelter, locking their doors and waiting for the night to pass. But one rider was still out there. Jacob Hale leaned forward in his saddle as his horse pushed through the heavy snow. The cold stung his face, and the wind tugged at the brim of his hat. He had spent most of his life on these plains, and storms like this were nothing new to him. Still, even a seasoned cowboy knew when a storm meant trouble. He had been on his way back from checking the cattle when the sky darkened without warning. The air had turned sharp and bitter, and soon the snow began to fall. Now the trail was nearly gone, buried beneath the drifting snow. His horse snorted and slowed its pace. Jacob gently patted the animal's neck. "Easy now," he murmured. "We will be home soon." The ranch was still miles away, but he knew the land well enough to find his way even in a storm. Then something caught his eye. At first he thought it was just another dark shape in the snow. But as he rode closer, the shape became clearer. Half buried in the storm stood a wagon. One wheel leaned at a strange angle, and the canvas top had been torn by the wind. Jacob pulled the reins and stopped. A wagon out here in weather like this made no sense. Most travelers would have reached town long before the storm arrived. The wind roared again, carrying loose snow across the ground. For a moment he considered riding on. The storm was growing worse with every minute. But something about the lonely wagon bothered him. Jacob turned his horse and guided it closer. As he approached, a strange feeling settled in his chest. The wagon looked abandoned, yet something told him he was not the only soul standing in that storm. Jacob guided his horse slowly toward the broken wagon. The snow was already piling high around its wheels, and the torn canvas snapped loudly in the wind. Up close, the wagon looked worse than he first thought. One wheel had sunk deep into the frozen ground, twisted at an angle that made it clear the wagon had not moved for some time. He looked around the empty land. No other horses. No tracks that had not already been buried by the snow. No sign of the driver. "That is strange," Jacob muttered quietly. Travelers did not simply leave their wagons behind unless something had gone very wrong. He swung down from his saddle and tied his horse loosely to a wooden rail on the side of the wagon. The wind pushed hard against him as he stepped closer. Snow crunched beneath his boots. "Hello," he called out. His voice disappeared into the storm. No answer came. Jacob moved to the back of the wagon and lifted the loose canvas. Inside were a few scattered supplies. A small trunk lay on its side. A blanket had fallen into the snow. It looked like someone had searched through the wagon in a hurry. He frowned. Then he heard it. A faint sound. So quiet he almost missed it. A weak breath. Jacob turned quickly and scanned the ground around the wagon. For a moment he saw nothing but snow blowing across the plain. Then he spotted a shape near the back wheel. Someone was lying there. He rushed forward, kneeling down in the snow. A young woman was curled against the wagon as if trying to hide from the wind. Her dress was thin and dusted with snow. Her hands were pale and trembling. Her eyes were barely open. "Miss," Jacob said, his voice steady but urgent. She tried to speak, but only a weak whisper came out. "Please, don't leave me." The words were so soft they almost vanished in the wind. Jacob felt a tight pull in his chest. The cold had already taken most of her strength. If he had ridden past the wagon without stopping, she would not have lasted much longer. He removed his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You are safe now," he said firmly. For the first time since he had found the wagon, Jacob knew one thing for certain. He could not leave her here. Jacob lifted the young woman carefully from the frozen ground. She was light, far too light, and her body trembled from the cold. He wrapped his coat tighter around her shoulders and helped her sit against the side of the wagon where the wind was a little weaker. "Easy now," he said in a calm voice. "You are going to be all right." Her eyes opened slowly. They were tired and filled with fear, yet there was a quiet strength behind them. Snow clung to her hair and the edge of her dress. Jacob pulled a small canteen from his saddlebag and held it out to her. "Take a sip." Her hands shook as she accepted it. She drank a little water and coughed softly. After a moment she looked up at him, studying his face as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. "My name is Jacob," he said. "What is yours?" She swallowed before answering. "Emily." Her voice was weak, but clearer now. "What happened here, Emily?" Jacob asked gently. For a moment she said nothing. The wind whistled through the torn canvas of the wagon. Finally she looked down at her hands. "I came here to be married," she said quietly. Jacob waited. She took a slow breath and continued. "I answered an advertisement months ago. A man from this territory wrote letters to me. He said he owned land and needed a wife to help him build a home. He sounded kind in his letters. He promised me a new beginning." Her eyes filled with sadness. "I traveled for weeks to reach this place. Trains, wagons, and roads I had never seen before. I left everything behind because I believed him." Jacob felt a heavy silence settle between them. "When I arrived in town this morning, he met me," Emily continued. "At first he seemed polite, but something was different. He kept looking around like he did not want anyone to see us talking." She paused and looked toward the broken wagon. "He told me he would take me to his ranch. But when we reached this place, he stopped the wagon. He said he had changed his mind." Jacob frowned. "He just left you?" Emily nodded slowly. "He said he was not ready for marriage. That people would talk if they knew he had ordered a bride through the mail. I begged him not to leave me out here. I had no money left and nowhere to go." Her voice cracked slightly. "But he climbed back onto his horse and rode away." The storm had already begun by then. Emily had waited beside the wagon, hoping he might return. "He never did," she whispered. Jacob looked at the endless snow around them. The storm had grown stronger with every hour. Emily lowered her eyes again. "I thought this was where my story would end." For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Jacob stood up slowly and offered her his hand. "Not today," he said quietly. The wind pushed hard across the open land as Jacob stood beside the wagon. Snow swirled around his boots, already covering the tracks his horse had made. The storm was growing stronger by the minute, and the sky above had turned a deep gray. Emily sat wrapped in his coat, trying to keep her hands steady. Her face was pale from the cold, and her eyes showed the kind of exhaustion that came from fear as much as from the weather. Jacob looked toward the faint direction of town. It was many miles away, and the trail was nearly gone beneath the drifting snow. He knew what the sensible choice should be. If he pushed hard enough, he might reach the edge of town before nightfall. Someone there could take her in. There were boarding houses and warm fires. She would be surrounded by people instead of the empty plains. But another thought crossed his mind. Towns asked questions. Too many questions. People talked. Rumors spread quickly in small places. A young woman abandoned by the man who promised to marry her would soon become the subject of whispers and judging eyes. Jacob had seen it happen before. He looked back at Emily. She sat quietly, watching the storm move across the land. There was a kind of quiet strength in her, but she was worn down and alone. Jacob had spent years avoiding trouble and staying away from other people's problems. His ranch was small and far from town. Most days he spoke to no one except his horse. Life was simpler that way. Helping strangers often brought complications. And bringing a young woman to his ranch would surely raise questions if anyone found out. The wind howled again, louder this time. Emily shivered, pulling the coat tighter around herself. Jacob felt a weight settle in his chest. Leaving her in town might be safer for him, but getting there through this storm would not be easy. She was already weak from the cold. Another long ride might be too much for her. He rubbed a gloved hand across his jaw and looked once more at the endless white plains. Then he made his decision. Jacob walked over to his horse and untied the reins. He stepped back to Emily and held out his hand. "You are coming with me," he said. Emily looked up at him, surprised. "Where?" she asked softly. "My ranch," Jacob replied. "It is closer than town, and it is warm." For a moment she hesitated, unsure of what to say. Then she slowly placed her hand in his. In the middle of that cold and empty storm, a small piece of hope returned. Jacob helped Emily onto the horse first. She moved slowly, her strength still weak from the cold. Once she was steady in the saddle, he climbed up behind her and took the reins. The wind roared across the plains, pushing waves of snow against them. It was hard to see more than a few yards ahead. The trail that normally led to his ranch had almost disappeared. Jacob leaned close to Emily so she could hear him. "Hold on to the saddle," he said calmly. "My horse knows the way." She nodded and gripped the saddle horn with trembling hands. They moved forward through the storm at a careful pace. The horse lowered its head and pushed through the deep snow, step by step. Ice stung their faces, and the wind tried to pull the warmth from their bodies. Emily shivered again. Without a word, Jacob pulled the edge of his coat around her shoulders and held it closed against the wind. She could feel the steady strength of his arm keeping her in place. Minutes felt like hours as they rode through the endless white. But Jacob kept his eyes forward. Somewhere ahead, through the storm and darkness, a small cabin waited with a fire that could save them both. At last, a faint shape appeared through the blowing snow. Jacob narrowed his eyes and leaned forward in the saddle. There it was. His cabin stood at the edge of a small rise, its roof covered in snow and its wooden walls dark against the white land. A thin trail of smoke no longer rose from the chimney, but the sight of the place still brought relief. "We made it," he said quietly. The horse climbed the short slope and stopped near the door. Jacob climbed down first, his boots sinking into the deep snow. Then he gently helped Emily down from the saddle. Her legs were weak, and she leaned on his arm to steady herself. "Come inside," he said. He pushed open the wooden door, and the cold air rushed into the quiet cabin. The room was small but solid, with a table, a narrow bed, and a stone fireplace along the wall. Jacob quickly moved to the fireplace and knelt down. Within moments he had a fire started. The dry wood caught the flame, and soon warm light began to fill the room. Emily sat near the fire, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. For the first time since the storm began, she felt warmth return to her hands. And for the first time that day, she felt safe. The storm continued through the night, but inside the small cabin the fire burned steadily. The warm light filled the room and slowly chased away the cold that had followed them inside. Emily rested in the narrow bed while Jacob placed another log on the fire. He had given her a bowl of hot stew and a cup of warm tea. At first she could barely hold the spoon, but the warmth helped bring strength back to her body. By morning the wind had softened. Pale sunlight slipped through the small window. Emily sat at the table wrapped in a thick blanket while Jacob poured coffee into 2 tin cups. For a while they sat quietly, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. "You live out here alone?" she asked gently. Jacob nodded. "Been that way for years." He kept his voice simple, but there was a hint of sadness behind it. Emily studied the quiet cabin. It was plain and worn, yet everything inside showed care and hard work. "You did not have to help me," she said softly. Jacob looked at the fire for a moment before answering. "Maybe not," he said. "But leaving you out there did not feel right." Emily felt something warm that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time since she had arrived in the territory, she no longer felt completely alone. 2 days passed, and the storm finally moved on. The sky cleared, leaving the land quiet and bright under fresh snow. Smoke rose once again from the chimney of Jacob's cabin, and the world seemed calm. Emily had regained much of her strength. She helped with small tasks around the cabin, and the silence between her and Jacob had grown easier. They spoke more now, sharing simple stories while the fire burned in the evenings. But peace on the frontier rarely lasted long. On the 3rd morning, Jacob stepped outside to check the horses. As he looked across the open land, he noticed movement in the distance. 2 riders were heading toward the ranch. He watched them carefully, his eyes narrowing as they drew closer. Visitors were rare this far from town, and strangers often meant trouble. Inside the cabin, Emily was washing a cup when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Her hands froze. A familiar feeling of fear returned to her chest. Jacob stepped back inside, his expression serious. "Riders are coming," he said calmly. Emily's face grew pale. For a moment neither of them spoke. She already knew who it might be. The man who had abandoned her in the storm had likely realized she survived. And now he might be coming back. Jacob stood by the door, watching the riders approach. His hand rested on the handle of his rifle, though he hoped it would not come to that. He had no intention of letting anyone harm Emily or question her safety. Emily moved behind him, gripping the edge of the table. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had felt helpless before, abandoned in the storm, but now she was not alone. The riders came closer. Jacob's eyes met theirs, steady and unyielding. "This is private property," he called out. "You have no business here." One of the riders slowed, then sneered. "Is this the girl from town? Thought she belonged to me." Jacob stepped forward, putting himself between Emily and the men. "She belongs to no one but herself. And she will stay here where she is safe." The riders exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected fear, not defiance. Emily looked at Jacob, a small spark of hope returning to her eyes. He was fighting for her when she could not fight for herself. The riders finally turned away, muttering, leaving the snow-covered land behind. Emily exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. For the first time since the storm, she realized that hope was not just a fragile thing it could survive, and sometimes it could even be defended. The sun rose over the snow-covered plains, casting a soft golden light across Jacob's cabin. The storm had passed, leaving the world quiet and still. Emily stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air. For the first time in weeks, she felt free from fear. The snow glistened around her, and the land no longer seemed empty or hostile. Jacob joined her, adjusting the saddle on his horse. He had been quiet all morning, but his eyes held a warmth she had come to trust. "You don't have to go anywhere," he said gently. Emily smiled, a weight lifting from her shoulders. "I think I've found a place to stay," she replied. They stood together for a moment, watching the sun climb higher. The storm had brought them together, but it was hope and trust that would guide their new life. For both of them, this was more than survival, it was a beginning. Sometimes hope arrives in the harshest storms, and sometimes it rides in on the back of a lone cowboy.